I'll do my best to keep an eye on the chat, but if not, Rachel will be here to also keep an eye. So as Rachel said, my name is Chris Bench. I am a professional SAT, ACT tutor, a little PSAT along the way also. Been doing it for close to 9 years at this point. So you know, I've seen an awful lot of tests come and go, and worked for a number of companies around the country and in the greater Chicago area. Today, we are going to be talking about the three tests that I just mentioned, the PSAT, the SAT, and the ACT. These are the three main standardized tests, national standardized tests, that are used in middle school and high school. We're going to be talking about what each one does, how they differ, how they're similar, and what strategies you can use to succeed on them. So without further ado, I want to start by talking about the PSAT. The PSAT, or sometimes the NumSquat, much less sort of rolling off the tongue pithy there. The PSAT is a scaled down version of the SAT that is typically administered sometimes in middle school, sometimes in 8th grade as a sort of qualifying exam to be admitted into college level classes and the like, but more often in the 10th and most frequently in the 11th grades. The NMSQT stands for National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test. It takes that name because your score, your performance on that exam makes you eligible for a broad range of different national scholarships that I know benefited me greatly when I was going to college, and could potentially benefit you as well. Typically, the PSAT is administered through the high school. This differs from the SAT and the ACT. Talk about how they're administered down the road. But usually you show up for school one day, they take you off to the cafeteria or some random classroom or something and sit you down with your number 2 pencils and are like, congratulations for taking a standardized test today. The date's going to vary from school district to school district. It's typically administered in mid-October. Get your scores by the end of the school year, a little bit before the winter holidays. And that test date varies from school district to school. The PSAT is not used for college admissions, but your score might be advertised to colleges. Colleges will buy lists of high scoring students from the PSAT NumSquat administering company, the College Board, and they will then use that to advertise to students. So if you score very well on this, you might find yourself getting an awful lot of brochures in the mail featuring, you know, fresh-faced youths playing ultimate frisbee on the cover or something. The scores on the PSAT range from 320 to 1520, just a little bit lower than the scores on the SAT. Do not ask me why they pick such random numbers. I have no clue. It seems unnecessarily complicated to me, but you know, I just teach kids how to take the test. I don't construct it. Half of that comes from writing, so 160 to 760 on the writing and reading part, the verbal side. And 160 to 760 on the math side. So it's just general sort of overview there. You know, the other purpose that the PSAT serves is to familiarize students with these sorts of big standardized tests, particularly if you're going to be taking the SAT down the road. The PSAT and the SAT look very, very similar. We'll talk a little bit about how they differ, but the basic format is the same. Really, the SAT is just a little bit longer and a little bit tougher on a little bit more challenging content. So the PSAT has three parts. There's a reading test. It's broken up into 5 passages. You have to read a passage, a couple hundred words. One of those is going to be a double passage where there's 2 related passages that you're going to be asked to compare and contrast. You have 60 minutes for that, during which you're going to answer 47 questions. Little basic math there will tell you that gives you about 12 minutes per passage, 12 minutes per passage. The writing section has 4 passages, you get 35 minutes on that, 44 questions, 11 per, that's about 8 minutes per passage. The math section, there's two sections, a no calculator section and a calculator section, 17 questions and 31 questions respectively. Notable thing about the PSAT, most of these tests, all three of them are multiple choice. So select one of A, B, C, or D answers. Notably, the math section of the PSAT and also we'll see the SAT contain what are known as gridden questions, where you just have to straight up come up with an answer, some number, and then fill in a little grid to specify that number. So you can't just use, you can't sort of leverage the multiple choice answers throughout the entire exam. A little bit of information about, so that's general overview for the PSAT. Most of our time is going to be spent on the SAT and the ACT. Before we get to that properly, though, I want to talk a little bit about why these tests are important. And in particular, I want to refer you to the chart here. This shows the importance that most college admissions offices place on different criteria. And if you look there, you can see the first three categories. Far and away, the most important have to do with your grades in college prep courses. And then down the rung a little bit, grades in overall courses, so non-college prep courses that are included. And also just how hard, strength of curriculum, like how hard is your high school? Some high schools have stronger curriculum than others. The better your high school, you're going to get a bump for that. Then clocking in at number 4 here is admission test scores, specifically the ACT and the SAT. Now, this is changing. This study was run in the pre-COVID days. Even at that point in time, the SAT and ACT were being de-emphasized. They were becoming less important to college admissions offices. Since then, they have continued to become less important at really a rapid pace, frankly. That's not to say that they are unimportant. They are still a major criterion that colleges use for determining admissions. In most cases, the biggest exception there being the University of California system, which is prohibited by law from using any sort of standardized tests. So if you're applying to UC Davis, UCLA, UC Berkeley, UC San Francisco, whatever, any of those schools, there's no UC San Francisco, go to Berkeley. Any of those UC schools you will not be submitting your test scores. Most any other school, you probably will, though there are a number of schools that are now test optional. Some schools did this before the pandemic. University of Chicago is a notable example. Many schools since then have gone test optional. The degree to which colleges, so a lot of colleges have gone test optional. It's a little unclear the degree to which schools are admitting students without standardized test scores. So it's all well and good for them to say, hey, we don't care whether or not you submit your scores. They haven't really put out a whole lot of information showing whether or not students that don't submit their scores are getting in at comparable rates to students who do submit their scores. And so, you kind of got to just trust them on their word that students that don't submit scores are looked at with equal weight compared to those who do. So rolling right along here, I want to turn to the SAT. So this is the first of the two main tests. So the SAT is administered two ways. It's usually administered independently, which is to say that you go to the College Board website. College Board is a company that administers the SAT, and you give them, I forget what it is at the moment, $50 thereabouts. I should know this. Sign up for a test, register for a test, and show up some Saturday morning, oftentimes at a school, but it can be really anywhere. They have them at the Freemasons Hall, I know, in some places. Community center, sometimes churches, mosques, synagogues, that sort of thing. Can be most anywhere. That said, many school districts will also offer the SAT to students. It's actually administered, in Illinois, there's a statewide program that purchases one testing session for students that is administered through the high school. It's true in many different states as well. As I mentioned earlier, it's designed primarily for juniors who would typically take it in the spring. There are also a number of fall test dates If possible, you want to take it in the spring and really nail it then and not have to worry about it in the fall. Fall of your senior year is a very busy time. You are doing all of your college applications. You are writing college essays. Most of you probably don't want to also be cramming for a giant standardized test. So I would recommend, if possible, get yourself ready to roll for the spring testing sessions, get it out of the way. As a private tutor, a lot of my clients are there in the fall because they didn't get the scores that they wanted in the spring. So I can see the sort of stress that they undergo. So please get yourself, if possible, sign up for this in the spring, get it out of the way. It's a lot easier to get through your fall semester of senior year if you've already taken care of this. Have the current test dates you can see up there. I will, by the way, put in the chat a link to this particular slideshow. At the end of the slideshow, you can copy that and have all of this for your reference. You can check in anytime. These dates are, of course, also available on the College Board website. The soonest date is this upcoming weekend. It is too late to register for that one. But there is an April 7th date as well. Just make sure you get on that sooner rather than later. The registration deadline is fast approaching. You see the other dates there. As mentioned earlier, the grading here is similar, but a little bit easier. There's a verbal side and a math side. Each of those, the scores range from 400 to 1600. I'm sorry, from 200 to 800. A perfect score is 2 800s or a composite score of 1600. Yeah, so Rachel points out, Rachel, thank you, that Illinois students are required to take the SAT as a graduation requirement. So you will be taking it as a junior. Just be aware that if you don't get the score that you want when you take it in school, you can also sign up for it on any of these Saturdays that you can see on this list here. The SAT is broken up into three main parts. There is a reading test. This is much like the PSAT reading test. So again, if any of you have taken the PSAT, you know roughly what this looks like. This is just a little bit longer. There's 5 passages instead of 4, and 65 minutes instead of 50, I think. Slightly longer, greater number of questions at 52. The writing section, very, very similar. The timing is basically identical also. 4 passages at a total of 35 minutes for a little over 8 minutes each. And again, there is a no calculator and calculator math section with gridding questions that is non-multiple choice questions, the timing on which is a little hazier. So we have a great question. Is the essay required? The SAT no longer has an essay. The SAT got rid of their essay in summer of 2021, last summer. You are not required to complete it because it does not exist. The ACT still has a essay component. If you sign up for the ACT, you get the option of taking that essay component. To be perfectly frank, I usually encourage students not to sign up for that. Colleges no longer require it. If you know that you are a strong writer, absolutely you should sign up for that because it's one more way to show that you excel. If you don't think that you are a strong writer, if you don't think that their colleges are going to look at your ACT essay score and be like, hey, here's another reason to bring this kid on board, don't bother, because most of the kids in the country take the SAT, and most of them therefore cannot take an essay. They're not being discriminated against because they're not completing an essay. It's no longer really it never was, to be perfectly honest, a huge part of the college admissions equation, and it is even less so now. Okay, switching over to the ACT side of things. So the ACT is, again, usually administered independently. Though some school districts will administer it, though not in the state of Illinois. Vedansh, so hold off on I'll come back to that, Vedansh, at the end of the presentation, because the essay is sort of a weird beast to talk about. So the ACT is usually administered independently, at least in the state of Illinois, where the schools administer the SAT. Like the SAT, it is designed primarily to be taken in the spring, though some students end up taking in the fall if they don't get the scores that they're hoping for. In 2022, or at least spring and summer of 2022, there are 3 test dates still on the books. You can see them there, and there's usually a few more: September, October, December. That December one is typically the last one available to students applying in the fall of this year. It goes out to colleges like the SAT, and like the SAT, it's the most important thing after your grades. The scores on the ACT run from 1 to 36 in 4 different sections: writing, math, reading, and science. You get a 1 through 36 in each of those. Those are then added up, divided by 4, and averaged to get a composite score, which is also out of 36. So as I mentioned earlier, 4 sections. There's an English section. This looks an awful lot like the English section on the SAT. You have 5 passages in 45 minutes. It's about 9 minutes each. 75 questions total. It is the most sort of rapid fire of these sections. You got to answer those questions quickly. The math test is 60 questions in 60 minutes, which is about a minute per. I should note, however, that those questions do get harder as they go along. The same is true of the math section on the SAT. So even though you technically have a minute per, you really want to be answering those early questions in less than a minute, so that you have a little bit of extra time for the later questions, which are more complicated and will likely take you longer. It take me longer. The reading test, a little bit more regularized than the SAT. It is 4 passages, one of which is a paired passage, for which you have 35 minutes. So the timing is similar, though, about 8 minutes each. Lastly, the ACT has a science section. The science section of the ACT is a little bit weird. It's about science in some sense, but you don't really have to know any science. Any information that you need, well, I shouldn't say that. Overwhelmingly, for about, I'm making a number up here, I'm going to say 98% of questions, the information that you need will be provided in the passage. And you just have to be able to read the passage along with the accompanying graphs and charts to pull that information out. There's sometimes I think once I've seen 2 questions that require you to have some outside knowledge. They're usually about some very important fundamental concept. Thinking about like just what is the Krebs cycle, or what Newton's second law for every action there must be an equal and opposite reaction. This is the first law. I don't remember anymore. You might have to know a little bit of information, but it's always going to be something very, some large concept from a science class, and will not be for more than, say, 2 questions, more likely 1, often 0 questions for the science section. What the science section is really about your ability to look at information, complicated information being provided in a number of different formats, sometimes paragraphs, sentences, sometimes graphs and charts, and Vedansh, I'll respond to that in a second. Sometimes graphs and charts, and extrapolate the information out, abstract that information, and interpret it divorced from the form that you see it in the test itself. So it's really about your ability to analyze and internalize data. It's not about knowing stuff the way that the actual sciences often are. So we have another question: which test would you want to take? Does it depend on what career you would like to do? So it certainly does not depend on the career you want to do. Your future career should have no bearing on this. As to which test you want to take, you should take the one that's more suited to your skills you're going to get a better score at. Personally, I recommend that if you have the time, the best thing to do is to go out and get yourself a copy of each of the 2 official SAT and ACT study guides published by the College Board. There will be a link to these later, and the ACT Corporation, respectively. They look kind of like this. They're each about $20 on Amazon, something like that. go out and get a copy. That there's a bunch of old tests in both of those books. Take one of each, and you can go online, and there are a ton of websites that offer you sort of score conversions. Figure out what you're better at. Students that read more quickly, the ACT reading passages tend to require you to be a faster reader. By contrast, the SAT reading passages tend to have a higher reading level, like they're harder passages to read. So if you know that you struggle with speed, you might want to avoid the ACT and go for the SAT. If you know that you struggle with comprehension of old-fashioned language, oftentimes the SAT passages are archaic. They're from the 17th or 18th or 17th, 18th, 19th, early 20th centuries. If you know that old-fashioned language trips you up, then you might want to avoid the SAT because you're more likely to encounter that sort of archaic language. But again, the best thing to do is to take a test from each, compare them, and see where you're stronger to start out from. And thank you, Rachel, for that link. And some students, for example, the science section, just, if you know you're bad at interpreting graphs and charts, head for the SAT, because that ACT section is going to give you some real trouble. The optional essay section. So Vedansh, this is going to address a little bit of what you have to say, but I'll come to that more deeply down the road. Should I take the essay? You probably don't want to. Like I said, it's been discontinued. It's no longer as important as it used to be. And in particular, most American students do not take the SAT. The SAT no longer has an essay component. That means that it's not even a thing that all students have. There's no score for them to compare against everybody. So schools are really de-emphasizing it as a result. The format of the ACT essay, this is the one that does still exist. You are given 3 different positions on some topic, and you have to sort of compare and contrast the 3 different positions, talk about the strengths and weaknesses of each, and then, stake out your own position with respect to those different positions that they provide for you. It's a weird essay format that requires you to sort of synthesize a lot of information very quickly, and to not write that sort of standard middle school 5-paragraph, here's my main idea, my 3 supports kind of essay, because you really, they explicitly say that you have to engage with multiple different positions. So you have to think about this essay differently than you do that sort of standard middle school style 5-paragraph essay that you may be most used to writing. As a result, because it has this peculiar format, the best way to study for it really is to get that big red real ACT book and to try out a couple of practice essays from there. That's the only way that you're going to get a sense of this particular idiosyncratic essay format, which you're not likely to see anywhere else. So as I mentioned earlier, the ACT essay is not mandatory. It is not mandatory. And I really don't even recommend it for most students unless you know that you are a strong writer and that your essay score is likely to sort of be something that recommends you and sets you apart from other students. Because the SAT got rid of its essay, it's no longer it was never a particularly important part of college admissions, and now it is even less so. So if you are a strong writer, if you know that if you know that writing an in-class essay is a skill that you have, it's a weird skill that is not really necessarily transferred into the real world unless you plan on being a journalist. But if you do happen to have that skill, go for it, sign up for that ACT essay, show off in that way that you can. If you have any thoughts that hey, I think this is going to be a weakness for me, I'm just, I'm not the strongest in-class essay writer. Maybe you're a good writer, you just can't do the in-class thing. That's true of a lot of students. Just avoid it. Just do the straight ACT without the essay, or go for the SAT where you can't take an essay at all. All right. So again, a couple comparisons. The SAT and the AC differ in a number of ways. The SAT, as mentioned earlier, has a separate no calculator and calculator section. The ACT, you are allowed to use your calculator throughout. The SAT has those grid-in questions. The ACT, by contrast, no grid-in questions. The entire math section is multiple choice. In the SAT, the reading passages are longer. You are more likely to encounter old-fashioned 19th century, 18th century language. You also have more time, though. ACT, the language is a little bit more straightforward, but you better be quick because the timing is tight. Reading passages. Oh, one notable thing about the SAT reading section has paired evidence questions. This is where they will ask you some question about the passage, and then the following question will be a question that asks, which of the following line numbers provides the best evidence for the preceding question. These are notable because, frankly, because they're hard. Many students find these particular questions quite difficult. So again, if you take a practice SAT and you find that these are super hard for you, it might be a reason for you to look to the ACT. Vedansh, I don't have a specific, so there's hundreds of calculators out there. I don't have all the different calculator brands and models, makes and models memorized. You can go online and find lists of calculators. These days, it is very few calculators that are not allowed. Just search for SAT banned calculators, something like that. You should find that list very easily. But there's only a handful. I do know that you are not allowed to use ones that plug in and have the little spool of tape, which I think is really tragic. So no paired evidence questions on the ACT. No longer any essay at all on the SAT. The ACT does have the weird comparing different viewpoints essay. And Rachel, thank you for pointing that out. I'm going to talk a little bit at the very end about the new format for the SAT that's upcoming. But that's a whole other beast, and we'll get to that in a minute. It will not apply for most of you. So I want to get a little bit more in depth here with a couple of specific sorts of hints for strategies on questions that you might want to use. And this goes out to the English and writing sections. The English section on one, the writing section on the other. I can never remember which is which, but they essentially test the same set of skills: grammar, organization, sentence structure, that sort of thing. Both the SAT and the ACT, you have about 8 minutes per passage. One thing that you want to do, overwhelmingly, most students do best if they read the entire passage. Occasionally, students will sort of skip from question to question and ignore the information between, ignore the passage in between. Generally speaking, you want to avoid that because it's going to really diminish your overall comprehension. And when you get to those main idea questions or organization questions, it's really going to hamper your ability to answer those particular questions. Most of these questions you're going to want to answer by ear, by which I mean, a lot of these questions, most of these questions are on stuff like grammar. And you want to just go along and listen for those grammar errors. So if it says I are walking down the street and you get that little thing at the base of your brain that goes, ugh, that just sounds bad. Listen to that ugh. That ugh is going to guide you through most of this section. The questions here, there's a lot of them for each. You have to answer quickly. And so you really do have to be able to go answer by ear. That said, there are certainly a number of questions where your ear will not guide you, most notably punctuation, right? The pause that you may take for a dash and the pause that you may take for a comma or for a period or whatever, they all sound alike. Those punctuation problems in particular, it is really important that you sit back and actually think of, first of all, know the grammar rules that govern the usage of the different marks of punctuation, and then that you stop and analyze the sentence structure, analyze the meaning of the context to get to the right answer. It's also important that one of the best strategies for helping you to do this is to start with the answers and begin by identifying how the answers differ from one another. So if you'll note on our example here, which is actually about a passage about the Art Institute of Chicago, notably, if you look here, the first thing I would do when I approach this question is going to identify how these answers differ from one another. So you'll note that answers A and D is IT apostrophe S. Answers A and B both end with a semicolon, whereas C ends with a regular colon and D ends with a comma. By starting out with the answers, you can identify how they differ from one another. It will help you to start asking yourself pointed questions. Not does this feel right? Does it sound right? But like, okay, what are the rules that govern colon usage? What are the rules that govern semicolon usage? How do they apply here? So hopefully y'all out there know that semicolons happen, should be placed only between independent clauses. We see here the Thorne miniature rooms, that is not an independent clause, cannot use a semicolon in this situation. By analyzing how they differ from one another, it helps you to more precisely frame the question about which is better and which is worse. And now you're not just going off your gut reaction, you're actually thinking it through and trying to apply the different grammar rules. With regard, another quick pointer with regard to organization problems, look for what are called deictics, which is not a word that you need to know. But these are basically TH words like this, that, those, these, that, even the. Because anytime you see one of those, it's to refer back to something usually in a preceding sentence. So if I ask you for an apple versus the apple, if I'm asking you for an apple, there's just any apple in the world out there. If I ask you for the apple, there's an assumption that we already have talked about some apple somewhere and you know which one. Looking out for those TH words, those deictics. Hey, you've got a sentence that you've got to place organizationally within a paragraph. It's got a deictic. The word that it is referring to should already occur, usually in the sentence beforehand. The same goes for pronouns. If you've got 4 different sentences, he did this, he did that, he flew a kite, he signed the Declaration of Independence, Benjamin Franklin is one of the founding fathers. You want Benjamin Franklin to be at the front of that paragraph, all the he's to come after it, so that we know what those pronouns refer to. Transitions, similarly, keep in mind what the structure and organization of the argument is, so that the transitions can guide you through that argument. In the reading section, so the reading section, as mentioned, the timing is different between the 2 tests, only 8 minutes for the ACT, 13 minutes for the SAT. The best way to improve your reading section performance is to, in your own free time, read. This is, I work with a ton of students that are trying to improve their reading, and, I can help students up to a certain point. But there is nothing that I can do that will come anywhere close to spending half an hour a day with your nose buried in a book, particularly a book that you find a little bit challenging. Not crazy hard, doesn't have to be some big giant, don't have to read Moby Dick, though you should, it's great. Just have to read something that's going to challenge you to work a little bit to get exactly what's going on. That said, some pointers for specifically the test. Always make sure that you read the introduction before a passage begins. There's usually a couple of sentences that give the author a title, a year of publication, sometimes some useful background information. That background information can be really important. Sometimes, for example, if there's a fiction passage, it might tell you what the relationship between the characters is. If these 2 characters are a mother and son versus a boyfriend and a girlfriend, you're going to understand that passage very differently, knowing what those relationships are, if it's one versus the other. Make sure that you go through and read that introductory bit. And then when it comes to the passage proper, a couple of things that you can do, annotate as you go, which is to say, do things like underline important sentences, circle key words. I like to label paragraphs. If I'm reading a passage about cancer treatments, recent developments in cancer treatments, hey, this is the chemotherapy paragraph. I might write chemo in the margin. The next one's the radiation paragraph. I'm gonna write radiation or just rad, or I'll just circle in the text. Just something so that I can sort of understand the organization. Similarly, in a fiction passage, a lot of times I like to create, every time a new character gets introduced, especially if it gives a little sort of quick summary afterwards of who they are, I'll circle their name and note, hey, this is the admiral, this is the baker, this is the whatever. Makes it easier to keep track of. I have trouble keeping track of characters. I know that is a weakness of mine. So if I have a little list on the side of the page, I can just look to that. I'm going to be a lot more accurate. Everybody reads differently. There is no single best way to approach these passages. So the best thing that you can do is experiment with different approaches. Some students find that they do best if they read the questions first and then read the passage, so they're already prepped for what to look for. That's a great approach. Don't read the answers first, because most of those answers are wrong. But reading the questions first, many students find very helpful. Some students find reading the passage first is super useful. Some students find skimming, so just sort of running your eyes briefly across it, not going looking for all the details. But just sort of breezing through can save them a lot of time, give them a little bit more time on the back end to answer questions. Other students are hampered by that. I'm hampered by that. I'm a worse skimmer than I am a reader. For other students, it's better to just read the whole thing up front and then spend more time doing that and then have less time for the questions. Another popular approach is to just skim or read the first half of a passage and then skim the back half. So maybe you're not, maybe you need to save a little bit of time, but not a whole lot of time. Just skimming part of it can get you a few extra minutes without losing too much comprehension. So notably, I mentioned for the SAT question, they have those paired evidence questions. Again, these are the questions where they first of all ask you something about the passage, and then the follow-up question asks you what line numbers are comprise the best evidence for that. You always want to approach those as a pair. So every time I get to a new reading passage on the SAT, the very first thing I do is I just go through and I circle all those paired questions. They're really easy to pick out because they just list a bunch of line numbers. You can spot them at a glance. Circle them both, and that way that I know when I get to the first one, I should go and look at those line numbers for the second one. Significantly, you don't want to just read the line numbers. What I do is I draw a little line down the side of the passage next to each of those sets of line numbers. And then I'll read straight through from beginning to end so that I get all the context around it. And just keep my eye out for what's the most useful bit of information. Oftentimes, though, they'll include line numbers that only really make sense if you've got the full context. So you want to make sure that you're answering those questions in tandem. Don't answer one and then the other, but like sort of work them against each other, work them with one another. And always make sure that you identify them as soon as you turn to the SAT. In the math section typically covers everything up through pre-calculus. There will not be any calculus on the exam. If you find yourself trying to use calculus, you've made a mistake. Occasionally I'll get a kid trying to use calculus, and it's always a bad idea. There is no calculus on the SAT or the ACT. Likewise, occasionally there is some low-level trig. You should absolutely know what SOHCAHTOA is, but really that's most of it. Pretty much anything past SOHCAHTOA with a couple of exceptions, and that's stuff that you should learn in Algebra 2 or Pre-Calc. Anything that you would only learn a full-blown trig course, don't worry about. It will not be on the exam. Questions get harder as you go along. This is most clear on the ACT. In the SAT, it's a little bit weirder because they start out easy, get harder all through the multiple choice. Then when you get to the gridding questions at the end, they reset to being easy and start getting hard again. So it's sort of easy, medium, hard, then easy, medium, hard, all, it repeats itself when you get to those grading questions. The rough timing for the ACT that I like to suggest for students, so it's 60 questions. The first 20 questions, you want to be spending about 10 to 15 minutes. You want to get through those relatively quickly. The middle 20, you want to be shooting for about a minute per question. And then on the back end, the last 20, the hardest ones, you want to use that time that you saved on the front end so that you've got about 25 to 30 minutes to do those last 20 questions. That's going to vary from person to person. And, if you know the timing is a real challenge for you, or if you know that you're just not a great math student and those later questions aren't going to be great, sometimes it makes sense to just focus on earlier stuff and sort of ignore the last few questions, sacrifices to the time gods, I like to call them, because you should focus on the questions that you are more likely to get right. The worst thing that you can do is rush through the easy questions, get them, get a bunch of them wrong that you could have gotten if you had taken more time, and then spend a bunch of time on the later questions that you're not actually likely to answer in the first place correctly, when you should have spent that time on the earlier questions that you were more likely to get right. But knowing, again, it's taking a practice test, understanding sort of where your strengths and weaknesses throughout the section are the best way for you to sort of develop precise strategies for how best to manage your time within a section. So your calculator is your friend. There's obviously a calculator section on the SAT, and the calculator is allowed on all of the ACT. Particularly on the SAT, there are questions that are designed to test your ability to rapidly use your calculator. They are set up that way. It is not quite explicit, but more or less so. That said, don't be overly reliant on your calculator. I have students, particularly when it comes to like graphing equations and stuff, who will ignore perfectly easy, quick, speedy algebraic approaches in favor of just plugging stuff into their calculator. Plugging stuff into the calculator sometimes works, but it's often usually not the fastest approach, unless all that you're doing is raw computation. If you just need to multiply a whole bunch of like 3-digit numbers, calculator is your friend. But if you're looking for something a little bit more complicated than that, most of the time, if you can do it just pencil and paper longhand, it's going to be a better approach. Don't be afraid to work the answers. A backdoor approach, an empirical approach where you use the answers to try to answer the question. Sometimes that's really actually the only way to solve some problems, not typically, but oftentimes it is a strategy that is available to you. I usually think that in most cases, it's best to approach the problem directly. So if you do know how to approach a problem analytically without using the answers, that's usually preferable, but not always. And if you are stumped, don't hesitate to use those answers. The single most overlooked problem-solving strategy on the math section for both tests is if they give you an equation or a function and they give you points along the graph of that equation or the graph of that function, plug those points into the equation, into the function. You're going to eliminate a bunch of variables, and it is a thing that all of you know is an option, but for reasons that probably involved it being such a incredibly in some ways obvious problem-solving strategy, it's also easy to ignore. It is the most overlooked approach to solving problems in the math section. I think it is safe to say, do not hesitate to plug points into an equation. Plug points into, they give you that x and that y, plug it in for x and y in the equation. You just got rid of 2 variables. Even my excellent math students overlook this on the regular. Please don't forget about that as an option. Okay, on to the ACT science section. Again, this is only for the ACT. This is if you're not taking the SAT. Timing on this is a little tricky. For each different passage, you want to look at the number of questions associated, subtract 1. That's about how many minutes you have. So if it's a 7-question passage, you got 6 minutes. If it's a 5-question passage, you got 4 minutes. You have the idea. Make sure you read the passage first. I have had hundreds of students, literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students over the years. 2 of them did better on the science section going to the questions first. They were weird kids that took, they're very nice, but their brains worked in weird ways. It was better for them, but they were in the wild minority of students. Overwhelmingly, students do better in the science section if you get a good handle on what is going on in the passage and then start answering questions. Only then. That said, if you're looking at a bunch of graphs and charts, don't get hung up on the graphs and charts. Particularly don't start analyzing data. If you want to look at the title of the graph and the chart, note what the X and the Y axes represent, get a sort of general sense of how the thing functions. That's awesome. But don't get lost in the weeds. Too much stuff in there is not actually going to be relevant to answering questions. If you want to learn more about the ecology of bogs, your local librarian, Rachel, can help you with that in your free time when you're not in the middle of taking a giant standardized test. As mentioned earlier, the science section is not really about science. It's not about knowing stuff, give or take maybe one question per test. It's really about mediation. It's about being able to analyze the way that information has been presented to you in a wide variety of different formats, whether it be graphs, charts, big old block paragraphs, bullet point lists. They're going to throw information at you in a bunch of different formats. You got to be able to look at it in all those different formats, abstract it out so you have an understanding of what's going on, divorced from what's in front of you, and then sort of understand what's going on off of the page. Each science section has one conflicting viewpoints passage. It's always going to be 7 questions associated with it. Sometimes this is referred to as the fighting scientists passage. They're going to give you some sort of debate that exists in the scientific community, or that used to exist, or it's maybe a made-up debate among students, whatever. And they're going to say, hey, scientist A believes this, scientist B believes this, scientist C believes this, and ask you to sort of compare and contrast between them. A couple of pointers for these. These are typically the hardest passages in the science section for most students. Make sure you go through and, first of all, identify what the main claim for each scientist is, and then label it, right? So if this is about what killed the dinosaurs, and scientist A thinks that the dinosaurs were killed off by not flossing, right? No floss at the top. If scientist B thinks that they didn't wear their bike helmets and all got concussions and died off that way, right? No helmets on top of that one. It's way easier to glance back and go, hey, this is the dental floss guy, this is the bike helmet guy, than to just remember this is scientist A, scientist B, scientist C. Those labels don't mean anything. Give yourself labels that will be useful for you. All right, so common question that I get, what's the best way to study for this, that, or the other thing? I mentioned this earlier. The best place to start is to start by taking a full-length practice test. Do it under proper test-taking conditions. Be alone in a room, sitting upright at a desk. Make sure your phone is in a drawer somewhere where you can't get anywhere near it. Make sure the family pet is locked away. Keep strict time. So just give yourself the time that you are allowed for each section. It'll be right there at the beginning of the section when you start out. Tell you how many minutes you have. And then, if you can't take it all in one stretch, and that is the best way to do it in one 3 to 4 hour sitting, taking it section by section is still better than nothing. Then once you've taken that whole test, go through and analyze every single wrong answer. Figure out what the right answer is, and B, figure out how you could have gotten to that. How, what is the problem solving that you would have done in the math section? What is the evidence in the reading section or science section that you would have followed? What is the grammar rule that undergirds that answer in the writing section? Go through and figure out what are the rules at play. There are a lot of resources online. Pretty much any test question that you might be looking at, somebody has answered on some forum somewhere to explain why the right answer is what the right answer is. Make sure you know the relevant content knowledge, know your grammar rules, know the math concepts, know the vocabulary from the reading section. Vocabulary is tricky because there's so much vocabulary out there. And also look at how the questions are written. Try to learn to recognize different categories of questions. Know the kind of question, hey, is this a transition question to the writing section? Is this an organization question? Is this a main idea question? Being able to look at one of these questions at a glance and say, hey, this is what the kind of thing that it's asking me, will help you to know how to orient yourself towards that question when it comes to answering it. Even if you got an answer right, but it was still hard, go and analyze that also. Ask yourself, is there a better way to do this? Were there clues that you missed for solving it? Once you see the answer, sometimes you look back and you're like, oh man, like it was, it was right there all along, it was screaming at me and I missed it. Now I can see. Analyze that stuff so that you learn to see it at the next pass, so that you don't make the same mistakes twice. The hardest things to do here are problem solving, reading comprehension, and mathematical intuition, which is tied up with problem solving. Those are things that, it's not like learning how a semicolon works. You can only improve that stuff through practice. So take a bunch of practice tests. The two books that I mentioned earlier, again, I'm going to give you links for those in a minute. They both have a bunch of tests. There are more tests available online if you can dig them up. Take tests, analyze your answers. That is the best way to approach these particular exams. So here are the resources I mentioned earlier: the official SAT study guide, the official ACT prep guide. There are also officially released exams. There are 2 links there. So there are also third-party books out there. Vedansh, it does not matter the order. Any test is basically interchangeable with any other. There are a bunch of other test books out there. Peterson does some. I can look at my shelf. Barron's has some. Frankly, most of them are pretty bad. They're not terrible. They're better than nothing. I do like the Tutor TED's guides, particularly the ACT. I don't think he's published any for the SAT, but I think he's pretty good. The Barron's and the Petersons are less good. The Reddit, RSAT and RSACT communities are both highly active. They're a little bro-tastic. I'm not sure what's going on there. It seems like a lot of seems dude heavy to me, but I don't know. That said, there are a lot of good resources on there. That said, a lot of those kids are really kind of freaked out, and it can be maybe a slightly unproductive emotional environment. So if you found the Princeton to be helpful, that's great. So like I said, the Princeton and the Barron's, they're not terrible. There are just individual questions in there where I look at that and I go like, hey, that's poorly worded. That's not exactly the format that the test would use. They're a little bit off in a way that obviously with the official ones where you're just really working off of old tests that they, have already released and actually used. There's not going to be quite as good. The Tutor TED's one I like to recommend because it really does seem to me like those are every bit as good as the official exams. But if you find the Peterson one and the Barron's one helpful, by all means, that's awesome. And 98% of the questions, again, I'm making a number up there, the large majority of the questions in there are going to be perfectly good, perfectly effective, perfectly on point. There's going to be a few where it's a little bit off. Vedansh, excuse me, asks, in the front of the book, it has like 300 pages of information. So should I read those first or take a practice test first? So I would start with just taking a practice test, and then I would, use that to figure out where your strengths and weaknesses are. If you're already getting an 800 on the math section, there's no reason for you to be reading all of this stuff, the 150 pages about how to prepare for the math side of the exam, right? Or even if it's just you are a whiz at geometry, you maybe have trouble with algebra, but you're a whiz at the geometry, don't go and read the whole geometry section because you already know that stuff. Take the test, use that to identify your strengths and weaknesses, and then refer to that introductory material to help you address those weaknesses. We also have a question: are you able to take the SAT, ACT in the spring and in the fall? Yes, you can. How many times can you take the test? You can take it as many times as you want to. They do get reported to your colleges. So if you sign up for 15 tests, that's the thing that the colleges are going to be looking at and being like, oh, that's an awful lot of SATs. In general, though, the rule of thumb is that like if you're improving with each test that you take, colleges are like, well, whatever, he was struggling then, but like he's doing better now, she's doing better now, taking a bunch of tests, but he's learned a lot along the way. That's fine. If you're taking tests and you're just flatlining, you're getting the same score each time, you probably want to stop, because unless you feel that, hey, I am way more prepared now, it doesn't look like somebody who's on an upward swing. And is the SAT or ACT more viewed? There's no preference. Colleges, they do not care. SAT, ACT, one is as good as the other. It used to be different 50 years ago, even 40 years ago, whatever. In your lifetimes, one is as good as the other. Take whatever one you perform best on. Right. Additional knowledge, information, especially for content, so hey, you don't know your grammar rules, you don't know your math principles. Khan Academy and Purple Math are two great math resources. It's entirely possible that you have encountered these already in math classes along the way, in your high school experience or middle school experience. Grammar is a little trickier. I have a couple of resources here that both of which I think are very good. Prep Scholar has one, and there's I forget where the other one comes from, actually. I think it's just a high school somewhere. But they've got an excellent grammar guide that they put up for free on the internet. Both of those are fine resources. A couple of notes on if you struggle with test anxiety. One of the best ways to help to reduce your nerves, to be less anxious, is to just know what you're getting yourself into. Like I said, go out, take a practice test, take a couple practice tests. Don't be surprised. If you know already what's coming, if you know what each section of the test looks like, if you know the kinds of questions that the test asks, then you're going to be more at ease. You're not going to be sort of set on your back foot, to use an old boxing term. No, also, this test is not that important. Your grades are more important. On top of that, it is just one star in a constellation of different things that colleges look at. Also, there are a bajillion great colleges out there. Some of you may be under the impression that you can only live a happy, successful life if you go to an Ivy League college or something. I promise you that is not the case. Millions of people everywhere have great experiences going to all sorts of different kinds of colleges that require all sorts of different levels of standardized test performance. If you're only, and on top of that, like, hey, if your biggest concern is how much money you're going to make down the road, whatever, go to a middling state school and be a geology major, get hired by Shell Oil for $1 bajillion a year straight out of college. You'll make more money than you ever would being a psychology major at Harvard. Another good piece of advice: sign up for multiple test dates, particularly if you have anxiety. Knowing that you have other tests in the future that you can potentially take can be a good way to be like, you know what, this is just one more step on my testing journey. It is not all about the next, the next 3 hours do not define my entire life. That to be clear, 3 hours do not define anybody's entire life. But if you know that you have those extra testing dates, it is even less so. Make sure that you, understand sort of deep breathing. If you find yourself sort of freaking out mid-test, stop, close your eyes, count to 10, take some deep breaths, zen out for a second. One of the worst things that students do, particularly students that struggle with timing, is they just start rushing themselves. And rushing themselves, I mentioned this earlier, in a way that means that the oftentimes easier questions at the beginning of the section, they're just blowing through and not answering well, so that they can get to harder questions that they're less likely to get right in the first place at the end. Take the time you need to answer the questions correctly, and make sure that you are not getting frantic along the way. On a grander scheme, if anxiety is something you deal with in a big way, meditation practices can be a very helpful way to sort of control that on the macro level. If you're preparing for a test this weekend, it might be a little bit late for that. But having a good meditation practice is certainly something that helps a lot of people, in a larger sort of framework. And lastly, and this one, actually, this is empirical support. They've tested this for many different students. If you know that anxiety is an issue, when you get to the testing location, sit in your car, sit wherever, spend 10 minutes just free writing all of your anxieties. Just set your pen to page and just get everything that you could possibly think might possibly go wrong that you're worried about. Write it down on a piece of paper and take that piece of paper at the end of the 10 minutes, ball it up, toss it in a trash can, and then head in. Has been empirically shown to, for most students, reduce their anxiety level when actually taking the test, and correlates with higher test results, therefore. One second. Quick note. So this is building off of the how important is the standardized test question from the beginning. As I mentioned earlier, many schools have gone test optional during the COVID era. This was true before COVID, but it has been accelerated since then. University of California schools are not accepting, are prevented by law from looking at your test scores. That's an extreme case, but one way or another, it is absolutely the case that the SAT and the ACT are less important at present than they were certainly 3 years ago, also less important than they were 10 years ago, less important than they were 20 years ago, will likely be even less important 5 years from today, if any of you happen to be that young. In general, basically the admissions criteria has been leveled. Everything is a little bit more even than it used to be. Schools are emphasizing more than ever holistic, sort of whole person approaches to evaluating students. That said, that other sort of criteria may be more important, things like essays at this point. But admissions offices, it is also clear that, or it's not clear is the issue. Certainly they've been saying things aloud that, hey, this is how they're approaching things now. It is not fully clear the degree to which they have actually put these principles into effect, again, aside from the University of California system, where it is absolutely the case where they are not using these tests. The diminished, the fact that most colleges are currently test optional, it seems likely that this will continue to be the case moving forward, but it's also not entirely clear. We're still trying to figure out exactly what post-COVID America looks like, as in so many other realms. It seems likely that it will continue to be the case that these are less important, but it's hard to know exactly what the future holds, as hopefully all of you are aware. And everybody's still kind of making it up as they go along. And I believe that is it. Yeah. So I'm going to unshare my screen. How do I unshare my screen? Oh, over here. My bad. And ask, does anybody have any further questions? And thank you so much, everybody who asked questions along the way. I really appreciate it. Does anybody have any other questions? Oh, yes. Thank you.